This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Burke, your host. Follow and subscribe to listen to everything spy-related, fact and fiction. So my guest today really needs no introduction to the Spy Masters audience. It is, of course, Antonia Senior, and Antonia's been running this podcast brilliantly for the last 18 months. While Antonia will still be doing the history book buffs, she has left Spy Masters to concentrate on her new book, which is published today, Stalin's Apostles, the Cambridge Five and the Making of the Soviet Empire. And that's what we're going to be talking about over the next 2 episodes of Spy Masters, beginning with that period up to the point where it becomes apparent Maclean is about to be arrested. So over to Antonia. You know what? I'm going to say hello, Antonia, and welcome to Spy Masters, but it feels really weird saying hello to Spy Masters. I mean, it's been your show for the last 18 months.
I know, it feels really weird for me too, but I am delighted that it's in such immensely capable hands, Paul. There's nobody who knows more about this stuff than you, so yeah, good luck with it.
Well, metaphorical big shoes to follow. You notice I said metaphorically there.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would have had to have words otherwise.
I mean, you've interviewed some amazing people, though. I mean, David Petraeus is one, but you started, actually, I think the first interview was with David McCloskey, and that was before David McCloskey, who's now turned into one of the ones to watch in the spy fiction field, hasn't he?
Yeah, I was, I was quite lucky with that. I thought the book was amazing and I wanted him on. And then obviously lots of other people thought the book was amazing and now he's a bit of a superstar. And then because Spy Masters was quite sort of supportive to him early on, he's been on more recently where maybe he might have, and he's such a great guy. He's such a great guy. But I've had other brilliant fiction writers on whose work I've really loved. And the joy of doing this podcast is you get to kind of shine a spotlight on people whose work you love, and you can be nimble and selective. So I haven't bothered interviewing anybody whose work I thought was really boring or pedestrian. Why would I bother? I bring people who I think are really good and talk to them. And what could be more lovely?
Yeah. You've set a standard. I mean, people like Nigel West as well, so because for me, that's going to be a new thing, is dealing with the non-fiction.
Yeah, the non-fictions, I mean, I love doing the non-fiction, and I really liked as well, like I got in a couple of slightly sort of esoteric academics to talk about their kind of work, and I think that worked really well. So yeah, watch this space. I think I was kind of going to just concentrate on my other venture, History Book Buffs, but I think I'm going to miss the spy stuff too much, so I might do some more spy stuff. We'll see.
Well, and you're welcome back here anytime you fancy it.
Oh, thank you, Paul.
What about any tips then? Got any tips going forward?
To be honest, it's a gift. You don't have to work this that hard, because this is an area which is just by itself full of amazing stories.
Yeah,
and most of the people doing the writing about it are doing it precisely because it's incredible stories. It's morally chewy and murky most of the time. And there's brilliant people writing in and around this subject, and it's inexhaustible and brilliant. So yeah, no tips necessary, Paul. You're just going to have a brilliant time.
Yeah, well, no, that's the main thing. And I love it. The chance you get to ask authors questions is just brilliant. So we should explain to people, of course, why you're leaving, and it's to do with your brand new book.
Yeah, so I've got so much coming up. So I'm doing loads of work to publicise my new book, Stalin's Apostles. And I'm kind of, it's just, I've got a lot to do. So Stalin's Apostles, it's out April the 9th.
Well, so that's today. Obviously, you want people to buy the book. What else?
Leave me reviews on Amazon. Not horrible reviews. Paul, I had a review once for one of my novels which said, I really loved this book the first time I read it. When the second time round, I find it a bit boring. I was like, And they gave me 2 stars. I was like, are you kidding me? Of course it's boring. You know what happens, you lemon. So none of those reviews, please, people. Just the nice ones.
Just the nice ones. Okay, I'm pretty sure you're going to get some nice reviews for this book. What I thought, we're going to do 2 episodes, and I thought what we'd start with, going chronologically, follow the path of the book, the logic of the story, was to get to the period where Burgess and Maclean are just about to defect, and I think it's a good break point. So let's deal with that in the first episode. But just to talk about the book in general terms, I think you've laid out your thesis, if you like, pretty clearly in the title of the book, which is actually Stalin's Apostles, the Cambridge Five, and the Making of the Soviet Empire. And if I'm wrong, we're in trouble already. But no, I think that's it, though, isn't it? That's the sort of the thesis, is that it's not just a question of spying and betraying Britain, but actually how the Europe was shaped off the back of what these guys were doing.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I felt like the way these guys had been, the story had been told of these guys was a very Anglo-centric story. It's a story about a bunch of poshos who betray their country and betray the establishment, which nobody cares about the establishment anymore. We want it to be
Mm,
betrayed. And then they're protected by another bunch of poshos, and then they all go to Moscow and cry into their Reform Club ties.
yeah,
And there's a lot of truth in that. That's there. That story is there. But what I realized I wanted to, quite often people write the book they want to read, and I had read loads of words about the Cambridge Five, and I felt that I was none the wiser about sort of 2 central questions. One was, what does Stalin actually want from these guys? How did
mm,
what they were giving the Soviets fit into Stalin's wider strategic picture? And the second question that I really wanted to ask is, how much truth is there in some of these myths that,
mm,
they were young men seduced by a beautiful ideology that they couldn't have known was based on, horror and repression. How much is it the case that they were protected by the establishment? How much is it the case that they were even, a closed ring of 5 people? And what I began to unpick was a lot of those myths and a lot of
right,
that kind of, what I kind of like to think of as the Reform Club story of the
mm,
Cambridge Five. An awful lot of it turns out, is just kind of layer and layer and layer of reporting by other authors after the event. So what I
yeah.
wanted to do is strip everything back, go to the sources, which we can talk about later, but I was so lucky compared to earlier writers about how much is now available. Go back to the sources and look at these 2 interlinked questions. What did Stalin want from them, and how much of that mythology that's grown up around them is actually reasonable now that we actually know much more than we did about what was going on?
Yeah, no, that's a perfect setup, because I think one of the things is that myth. It's amazing how quickly we get this myth that develops around this story. And we think we know this story, but when you read your book, and you start to get into the detail the way you have, we only know a surface sort of story. And, how much of that is actually true is, again, something that we find out as we go along.
Yeah, and I think what happens to the Cambridge Five is they become a bit of a kind of culture war type thing before we even really use the words culture war. So your attitude to what they did kind of depended on how you felt about the existence
Mm,
of establishment, how you felt about kind of, white men being in charge of lots of things, how you felt about patriotism, So what I kind of thought was actually they'd got a bit of a free ride
mm,
in our kind of cultural perception of who they were and what they did. And I mean, I felt this too. My first exposure to them culturally was through the film Another Country, which was
right.
brought out in 1983, and it's a fictionalized version of Burgess. And in that, it's Rupert Everett, and he's, ravishingly gorgeous, and he's sort of dripping honey into the clavicles of young, gorgeous men at Eton and then being bullied for it. And, we sympathize with him. We sympathize with his sort of rebelliousness, his sort of raffish desire
Mm,
to, poke holes in the system that bullied him. And then you sort of look harder at who he really was and what he really did, and you think, no, I'm sorry, no. These were terrible men who betrayed all their friends, all their families. They behaved horribly to everybody that was closest to them. And they didn't just betray Britain, they betrayed all the men of Eastern and women and children of Eastern and Central Europe who they delivered happily and gleefully into the hands of Stalin. And, you know, we need to stop treating them as if there were sort of these kind of raffish heroes. You know, a bit
Yeah.
like, yeah,
Well, I was going to say, no, it is. There's almost this Robin Hood myth that kind of develops
right.
with these sorts of stories, and it's not right. And there's an awful lot in that now that we can start to dig into. And I think let's go right back to the start. So go back to the 1930s, the kind of Europe that we had with this ideological divide between Nazism and communism, and how that actually affected this 30s, the attitudes, the political atmosphere in 30s Cambridge.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. It was an ideologically divided continent. I think in Britain, there was a slightly different picture to the continent
Mm,
because in Britain, there was a existing tradition of leftist policies that was explicitly democratic, right? And that was very strongly sort of disseminated and held. Communism itself was kind of a smaller thing, and actually it was, you know, the numbers were actually quite small.
yeah,
There was, however, in the 1930s, a kind of spread, an ideological vogue amongst sort of the well-to-do youth who felt that the world had failed them. I guess, you know, they didn't fight in World War One, but they see the kind of aftermath of World War One. They see the aftermath of the Great Depression. They see, you know, the hunger marches, and their response is a rejection of the status quo and revolution, basically. So what was really interesting is that this, again, it's one of these slight myths that, you know, there's this idea that everybody in Cambridge in the 1930s was a revolutionary.
mm,
And when you were one of these guys, it must have felt like that. It must have felt sort of radiantly exciting and full of kind of revolutionary politics. And there's a very famous moment where there is a kind of there's a march, a peace march on kind of
yeah, right,
on Armistice Day. They go and lay a wreath, and then there's a kind of pacifist communist kind of response to the wreath laying, and they all get involved. And but you know, actually, if you look at Cambridge, there's sort of this the vast majority of Cambridge students are actually think that the communists are almost as ridiculous as the Nazis. You know, I came across this kind of procession where there'd been a kind of communist agitation, which they later write about in kind of glowing terms. But actually, the newspaper reports show that most of the kind of students and young people of Cambridge were just engaged in, you know, watching this other procession where they were kind of throwing sponges at kind of fake versions of Hitler and also fake versions of Stalin,
right.
right? And then you can see that there were debates where like the communists are voted down. There, you know, so I think it's slightly overplayed. Yes, there was this like massive swell of communist fervor, but there was also a massive swell of kind of central centrist ground politics, and which is wedded to democracy. And what I find quite irritating is this idea that these young people who, when you read them, not just the five, but their
Hmm.
contemporaries, they're revolutionaries. They want there to be bloodshed. You know, the blood is the point. One of the most influential kind of characters amongst this young kind of Cambridge milieu absolutely worships the Hungarian communist Bela Kun,
Mm,
who not despite the blood that Bela Kun shed, but
but
because of
because
it.
of, yeah,
It's that blood that's cleansing. It's the blood and fire that they want, right? They want to burn everything down before they can build their utopia.
yeah, which is a
And
crazy romantic idea.
yeah, and that just to flip again slightly to our modern perception, part of the thing that made me interested in writing the book was, you know, you wouldn't idealize now one of those kids that went off to fight for the fascists in the Spanish Civil War, right? You wouldn't idealize the young Nazis of the 1930s, But we do idolize the young communists of the 1930s, idealize rather than idolize, possibly. But even though, in the interim period, the kind of death, the horror, the misery, the devastation that communism wreaked across the world is like totally evident. We still idealize these guys.
Yeah, it
And
is bizarre that in the modern age we still, with all the information we have about the millions who died under Stalin, that we don't have that kind of combined perspective of them both as evils, essentially the same.
right. And then these young men, so they all become, so they arrive at Cambridge as students and they leave as revolutionaries. So there's five of them: Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, Anthony Blunt, John Cairncross. Who have I missed out?
In Philby.
Kim Philby. Jesus Christ, Paul. I've been doing so many interviews. Kim Philby, that's the fella.
And him.
And that guy. So they are revolutionaries, and one of the things I set out to establish is how much could they have known in the 1930s about Stalin. And what became obvious to me is that loads was known about Stalin in the 1930s. We knew about the famine, we knew about the terror, we knew about the dekulakaizations, we knew about the starving to death and the imprisonment of millions of peasants. And we deliberately forgot all that during the war. It was a propaganda exercise to eradicate, to whitewash Stalin's past during the war when he became our ally. And then in the 50s, we rediscovered these crimes as if they're new. They were
Yeah.
not new. They were known in the 30s. They knew about this. They just didn't care.
Okay, let's take that because it's something that Maclean said, I think, possibly to Philby, picking this up from the book now, about whether you work for the Comintern and the internationalist cause, or whether you work for a foreign spy agency, i.e., the NKVD, and the fact that those are two very, very different things. But what you're establishing straight away when you work for a spy agency is that you're not working for an international cause.
Yeah, so I mean, this is one of the things. So they're quite. So Donald Maclean particularly is really, really anti-imperialist, but he is very, very internationalist, right?
Mm,
So he believes in communist revolution throughout the world, and so that's why he has this. When Kim Philby is the first to be recruited by a brilliant recruiter called Arnold Deutsch in 1934, and then Kim Philby recruits Donald Maclean, and in the conversation around that, there's a sort of quibbling about whether or not Donald Maclean's going to be spying for Comintern, which is effectively the internationalist arm
mm.
of the, revolution, or for the Soviet Union, and they sort of wibble around this point. But they kind, Kim Philby knows, that everybody knows what Comintern is. It's a kind of fig leaf.
Yeah,
Um, and again, I guess I would argue that you can lie to yourself that you're acting for international revolution, but the main engine of international revolution in the 1930s is the Soviet Union,
yeah,
headed by Stalin, and you could ignore the stuff coming out from it, but I kind of think, Paul, that if you're committing to spy on your friends, your family, and your country on behalf of an organization, it's slightly incumbent on you to do a little bit of due diligence
yeah.
about what
No, I
that
think,
place is like.
when you're making protests, right? That's the moment you can be pure about wanting fairness in society and all those things. The moment you start working for a spy agency, you've gone beyond that. And now you're not doing it for good motives. And what you said makes sense. I mean, when we talk about what was actually going on in Russia, it was known by Gareth Jones, brought back all that information on the Ukrainian famine.
Mm.
There were other reporters. There were the incidents of the British engineers who were
Yeah.
arrested in Moscow. You know, Burgess himself went to Moscow in 34. So, he saw what was going on. So they have no fig leaf. They have no cover for
They
the idealism, do they?
They don't care. I mean, you know, uh, one of Burgess's friends said about him, if you tried to suggest that the Soviet Union was not a sort of beacon amazingness. Like, he effectively puts his fingers in his ears and shouts "La." You
Mm.
know, they do not want the facts to tarnish the vision. They do not want the inconvenient truths that are readily available everywhere to get in the way of the theory. I mean, they're theorists. They love it. Burgess, particularly, he's an intellectual communist who revels in the ideas and in the theory. And, you know, the fact that, like, a million Russian peasants have had to die for this theory doesn't matter to him. Doesn't matter. He knows, and if he doesn't know, he should have known, and he could have known. It's not like it's
Yeah,
a
right.
secret, right?
So it's willful blindness in that
It's
sense.
willful blindness,
Yeah,
and
and
it's
this
and
is
it's
what you said earlier. Now, this is the thing we give them credit for in myth, is that they might have had an ideological point of view that, had some validity.
we give them credit because we believe in their blindness. What I uncovered was a willful blindness, and
Mm,
in fact, almost more than that, a kind of a sense that actually you are a revolutionary, so you mustn't flinch from the cost of the revolution. So it's almost a reveling in it
yeah,
rather than a blindness to it.
but it could just, I mean, this is just a general point, but it kind of leads you back to the point where who the hell is the revolution for if there are dead bodies all over the streets? At the end of the day,
Paul, I just couldn't agree with you more. Like, who's left in the utopia? It's just you and your dog. Well,
yeah.
well played. I mean, fair, Stalin and his whatever. Yeah. Anyway, sorry. Yes.
No, no, no. It's fine. It's perfect. It makes the point, I think. But going back to the first time, 1934, Park
Mm.
Bench, Arnold Deutsch, and Philby. Tell us a little bit about the illegals and what the Russians were doing. Because one thing that struck me first of all was after the First World War, we just built up MI5 and MI6 as services, and the first thing we did after the war was cut them back again. And we never seemed prepared. But of course, the Russians were very prepared, and they had these illegals in Britain.
Yeah. So in the 1930s, there's this sort of incredible asymmetry between what's going on in terms of us spying on the Russians and them spying on us. You know, we've always had quite an outsized space in the Russian psyche. Like, they couldn't
It's true, yeah.
believe that we had no real mission to spy on them, but we really didn't. And
And
they
it still
didn't
persists to today, doesn't it?
yeah, this Britain as the sort of Satan. I wish we had the power they think we have, Paul. As we know, we don't even have a navy, let
No.
alone. Anyway, in this period, there are a kind of number of brilliant men and women who are Soviet agents. There's a lot of them are Austrian, actually, and they go out into the world and they recruit others to work for Soviet intelligence, and they're brilliant. You know, Arnold Deutsch, he's a he's a very clever man. He comes from Vienna. He's got various degrees. He's committed to the cause. He's been trained up. He's been sent out, and he's there. And he has, and it looks like it really was his idea, right?
Hmm.
I couldn't find much evidence that it wasn't his idea
Right.
to find young men and get them young. And maybe he was looking around Britain in 1934 and seeing this kind of phenomenon of the well-connected youth being quite into all of this. There's a lovely thing that I quote of in my book is Malcolm Muggeridge in his book on the 30s talks about, well-heeled debutantes declaring to their papas over breakfast that they're
Yeah.
dedicated revolutionaries, and they do this in front of the servants. You know what I mean? So it's like there's such nonsense. Anyway, so Deutsch is looking for young connected people who he can recruit early and then they can rise in the establishment. He has no idea at this stage how well that's going to work out because it is actually a massive kind of stroke of luck that later circumstances in the war
Yeah.
propel these guys up to where they get to. We'll talk about that later, I'm sure.
Hmm.
So he's looking for these young men, and again, it's a stroke of luck that he comes across the guy who will go on to be one of the best, spies the world has ever known, Kim Philby. And that connection happens because after his undergraduate degree, Kim Philby goes to Austria. He falls in love with a young Austrian communist called Litzy. They get married. Litzy's friend is another committed communist called Edith Tudor Hart.
Right.
And it is Edith Tudor Hart who suggests Kim Philby to Arnold Deutsch, who's looking for prey, effectively. So Deutsch meets Kim Philby on this park bench, and they utterly kind of seem to fall in love with each other.
Mm.
They talk about communist ideology. I mean, it turns out, I think, and this is, a reading I've put in my book, that they kind of get each other completely wrong. They're both playing a part, and
Yeah.
but it works. And Philby is recruited by Deutsch, and one of Deutsch's first tasks is find me other, more prey, more gullible young
Yeah.
men who
Yeah.
might be. So yeah, so Philby then recruits Donald Maclean. So Kim Philby is, the son of a guy called St. John Philby, who has a very colourful career in his own right. They're sort of,
I like the way you put that, colourful.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
he's
he is quite a
he's
character.
he's quite a character. Um, he and Donald Maclean is kind of, so there's another slight myth here that they were all like aristocrats. They
Mm.
weren't really aristocrats. Kim Philby came from a kind of the type of family that was a bit broke but running the empire, that they were always slightly outliving their means, but the sons were being sent to, you know, terrify the poor colonists of various posts of empire. Donald Maclean, his family, like his grandfather had been had lived on Tyree. I've been to Tyree, beautiful, beautiful place. It is not the stuff of aristocratic dreams. It is a very bleak and beautiful place. And that was his grandfather, and his father had become a Liberal MP. So this is another sort of thing. A lot of these guys come from quite liberal families,
Mm.
and so in order to rebel, they have to go hard left. They're not coming from kind of old Tory backgrounds where
Yeah, I
we're
see what you mean.
stretching back generations. So Donald Maclean has been a friend of Kim Philby's at Cambridge. He's a committed communist, very passionate in his beliefs. And Philby invites him to dinner in the family home on Acol Road in North London and puts to him, "Do you want to join the revolution?" Donald Maclean says, "Yes, please. Where do I sign?" So they're the first two.
Then we have Burgess. In fact, actually, let's go back just one second because it is interesting when you said about that Deutsch and Philby don't quite get each other.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a report where actually Arnold Deutsch actually says of Philby he'd find it difficult to tell lies, which is
Yeah.
a
He says,
phenomenal misreading.
yeah, he says, "Oh, poor Philby can't tell lies." Somebody else later, Philby's best friend from school, Tim Milne, says that. And Tim Milne knows him for years. And I found a report from naval intelligence in 1945 where Tim Milne basically goes, "Oh, I'm not sure he's wonderfully clever, but sometimes I worry he's too kind of nice for this intelligence world. He can't tell a lie." I'm like, Jesus Christ. This is a mark of Kim Philby's camouflage, that
Yeah.
people thought he was like,
Well,
thought that his fatal flaw was his honesty.
and when we get
Um,
into what actually happens as we go along, we'll see the
yeah,
depth of duplicity and lying in this
yeah,
character.
it's unbelievable. Meanwhile, Philby looks at Deutsch and thinks that he's having a meeting of minds and a kind of meeting of souls. And Deutsch is playing him. Deutsch is a
Yeah.
professional. Deutsch is like sitting on a bench with a young man who he wants to recruit into the aid, into the service of a foreign enemy. And he's playing him, so they're both kind of playing each other. It's really interesting, and Deutsch is saying all the right things and kind of flattering him and whatever, and they're kind of bonding over their shared love of sort of arcane Marxist dogma. And yeah, it's an extraordinary meeting. I go into quite a lot of detail in the book because I just think, this is
Oh,
an
it's
amazing
fascinating
thing.
stuff because I mean that really is about how we start to explore these characters and really start to understand them in a way that as we've said
Mm,
all along, just isn't there in the myth. Then we have
mm.
Burgess, and one thing is clear about Burgess right from the start, and everybody's pretty clear about this: is he's such an unreliable person.
Yeah, so Philby made this list of like possible communists that Deutsch might want to recruit, and Maclean was at the top, and Burgess was right at the bottom because Burgess was ideologically totally committed, and he was
Mm,
completely brilliant, right? He was a very clever man. Like everybody who met him said this.
yeah.
He was he was basically one of the reasons why we are so endlessly fascinated by Guy Burgess is the duality of him.
Hmm.
He was both brilliant and terrible. He was beautiful and yet kind of grubby. He was outrageous and
Mm.
annoying, but also funny and, and sort of irresistible. So he's sort of constantly dividing everybody who knows him into two very firm camps, those who kind of get him and adore him, and those who think he's absolutely horrible and ridiculous and like, too outrageous and too grubby for words.
Mm.
He's also as yeah kind of flaky, so that's why he's the bottom of Guy Burgess of Kim Philby's list. And then, you know one thing, Paul, is that we look back with hindsight because of the remarkable success of these guys, and we're like, God, it was all so clever and slick and whatever. But
Mm.
actually, when you actually go through it chronologically, so much of it seems unbelievably sort of haphazard and
Yeah.
and ridiculous. So Guy Burgess noticed that two of his best friends, Donald Maclean and Kim Philby, who had been committed rabid communists at college, had now become,
Suddenly turned their backs. Yeah.
yeah, suddenly they weren't communists anymore. They were like, oh well, there's something to be said for democracy and the rule of law. Um, and he was like, he got suspicious. He was like, there is something going on. I don't believe this. It's too much.
Mm.
So he badgered them and badgered them and badgered them. What's going on? Why are you lying? This is not, I don't believe you. And eventually, uh, they cracked and they were like, okay, actually, this is why we've been recruited by the Soviets. And Guy Burgess was like, brilliant, I want in. And Deutsch was initially, all the Soviet illegals were kind of like, oh, he's a bit flaky, but he is brilliant. He's very well connected. He can make friends very easily. And this turns out to be actually pretty much a masterstroke for a long time,
Yeah.
because Guy Burgess is brilliant at making connections, at, wheedling stuff out of people, at kind of collecting
Which gets him right
people.
to the top of the political system.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, it's actually quite a good mark. So, yeah, he's next, Guy Burgess.
So I'm not going to make you go through them all. I mean, we've got Anthony Blunt and we've got John Cairncross as well. Don't, people
Mm.
can read the book and get a sense of where they fall into the picture as well. I thought something you said was really interesting, and it's maybe something we forget. Aspiring is something very specific. I think the way you put it is not so much aspiring, which implies circular familiarity with each other, but a chain. And I think
Mm.
that's an important distinction.
I think it is a really important distinction. So, the term kind of Ring of Five came from a Soviet defector much later on, right?
Mm.
And this is much later on when basically Soviet intelligence effectively had within its kind of halls this idea that there were five people who were particularly brilliant bringing information out, and that they were kind of linked through Cambridge. But this all comes much later. To within what we think of as the Cambridge Five spiring, it wasn't aspiring at all.
Mm.
It was a kind of chain, as you say, and Cairncross didn't really. Cairncross was always the outsider. He was the outsider socially as well as, in terms of the ring. Um, Guy, as soon as they get recruited, Donald Maclean basically stops really having very much to do with the others as a sort of safety mechanism. The others, Anthony Blunt describes his relationship with Guy Burgess and Kim Philby as more like an isosceles triangle, with Burgess as the sort of apex and him and
Right. Yeah.
Philby as the other corners. And even the idea there's just five of them is a slight misnomer as well, because um what happens is they go off and they start becoming spies. And there are a number of ways where they get their information. One is recruiting sub-agents,
Mm.
which is Anthony Blunt's main job. His main job is to stay in Cambridge and recruit people. And I would just like to point out that when he was doing that, he was a very respected academic. He was
Yeah.
not a
Right.
young man. He was 30, and he was having young men come into his study to, learn from him. He was their tutor in a position of responsibility, and he was grooming them to become Soviet spies.
Mm.
I mean, he gets a very free pass, does Anthony Blunt, because he liked a picture. But I think, we would now look at that very askance,
Yeah, I
rightly.
think that's one thing that is in the book is this balance where we fully understand, and I don't think we have before really, unless somebody's gone into it in tremendous detail, seen Blunt and Cairncross in the same way as the others. It's
Yeah.
almost like they're an adjunct to the story, and they're not. They're right at the heart of this, and they're as bad as the others in terms of the betrayal and everything.
Absolutely, 100%. They sort of end up, I think, getting a bit of a pass, and that doesn't stack up. But yeah, so I identified, so they collect information from sub-agents. They also collect information from people who sort of know what they're up to, but it's never explicitly said, but they kind of know enough to guess, and they don't
Mm,
it doesn't stop them giving them information. And then there's another group of people who they're very close to, who they get information out of, and we have to basically assume that those people didn't really know that they were secret, that they were unwittingly being used as Soviet intelligence assets. And I identified about 22 people beyond the
yeah.
five who were basically wittingly or unwittingly through the five supplying the Soviets with really, really
Yeah.
good.
Some of whom are very clearly known about.
Yeah, yeah. So some were like, so for example, Blunt recruits Leo Long and Stuart
Mm,
Hampshire and guys like this who we know about. Um, and Gwanri Rees, who's another
yeah.
one who is recruited in. So there are ones that know that they're being recruited, and then
They are
there's
part of
other
the story,
people.
though, in the sense that they get let off as well. This all goes away. Goomri Rees in the end gives testimony, and we'll
Yeah,
get to that. But that's all that happens,
yeah. I
and
know, I know.
it goes through this story. In that context, then, okay, just starting at this point in the 1930s with the British security services, do they deserve any credit, or is this just a completely incompetent approach to? I mean, some of this stuff is in their face. You pointed out that Burgess was able to see what Maclean and Philby were doing, but it didn't occur to the Secret Service itself. Do they have any
Yeah,
kind of saving grace?
I yeah, I have huge amounts of sympathy for them
Right.
actually, for lots of reasons. So one is that they the Cambridge Five were protected by failure of imagination from
Mm,
amongst their peers, that their communism could run so deep that they would betray everything and everyone that that generation at that time held dear. And what we're talking about as well is is moving forward a bit, going into the war. What we're talking about is first of all, a period where, Hitler and Stalin are allies. So the idea
yes,
that you
right.
would be giving, Britain was facing an existential threat to its existence from 1939 onwards. And the idea that one's commitment to a slightly bizarre ideology could override all one's obligations to to your country, it was not even conceived of, right? It's only after the Cambridge Five are unmasked that we come to a realization that such a thing is possible. So I
Yeah,
understand
yeah,
that failure of imagination. The other thing that happens is obviously when the war breaks out. Donald Maclean and John Cairncross join the Foreign Office, but Burgess, Philby, and Blunt are not sort of in within government in the initial stages. They're kind of doing various things. But then when the war breaks out, there is a massive explosion of jobs
yeah, right.
in government,
Yeah,
right? From SOE to SI to MI6 to MI5. There is this sudden massive
yeah.
thirst for
I think
men.
you point out with MI5, it's like 10 times the number of people over a couple of years are employed.
Right. So where do you find these men? How
Mm,
do you find them quickly, right? How do you trust the men that you can find? Now we look back post the kind of unmasking of the Cambridge Five and think, well, what you don't do is get a chap that you went to school with. But at the time, right, getting a
yeah,
chap that you went to school with seemed like a very good
it
way
was
to
the way
to
things were done. Yeah,
guarantee that he wasn't a German spy
yeah,
because they weren't worried about the Soviets at this point. They were worried about Nazis. So if the chap that you went to school with, who was a decent bloke and he was clever, and you knew that he would be able to think up of mischievous ways to send people, to across the border at SOE or whatever, you know, that this was also the good that you knew him from school. This is a good thing. This is like you can vouch for him. And look, it's discredited, and obviously it wasn't ideal. And vetting, a little bit of vetting, a little bit more. They did do some vetting, but don't forget. So you can see the vetting of Kim Philby when he first is approached by, like the idea first arises that he could join the intelligence service,
right.
but he had deliberately not joined the Communist Party, right? He had
Mm,
being a Communist Party member was prompted more scrutiny than not being a Communist Party member.
Yeah, I know. It's with hindsight, but it does seem obvious in a way that, if you were going to be a spy, being part of the Communist Party of Great Britain was probably not a great idea. And in fact, the kind of people who were in the Communist Party of Great Britain, these working class revolutionaries, were never going to amount to very much, but they're actually the ones under surveillance
I
because
know,
they didn't go to the right school and they're not the pals.
but but it's also, it's not just that they didn't go to the right school. It's because nobody really took the posh commies very seriously, right?
Mm.
They believed in the revolutionary credentials of the working class ones. So I found, for example, the poet Cecil Day Lewis was being vetted for something. And the MI5 guy who was vetting him for a secret job said, "Yeah, he is a commie, but he's one of these intellectual types. He's not like a proper revolutionary because, how could he be? Like, how could anybody who actually comes from his type of background actually want to destroy everything that gives them all their privilege? It doesn't make any
Mm.
sense." So I just don't think that MI5 took, and SOE, because SOE is stuffed full of communists. I mean, my
Yeah,
God, you could barely throw a stone without hitting a communist in SOE. Certainly in, bits of it. No, but nobody took it that seriously, right? They thought, okay, fine, he's got like leftist politics, but we're facing this existential crisis. We're all anti-fascist, and they didn't understand that they were sort of letting the fox into the chicken
yeah.
coop.
There's an odd thing there as well. That time when the Germans and the Russians, after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, appeared to be on the same side, and that makes it very difficult for the Russians in Britain. These spies, these five, and Maclean in particular, almost sends a love letter to Moscow saying, "I love you. Please don't desert me." They are proactive in continuing what they do to make sure that the links don't fall apart.
I'm really glad you picked up on that, Paul. That's one of the things that I've really, really, really wanted to get across. There's a moment after the terror where basically all the illegals who recruited these guys have disappeared
Mm,
because they've been sent back to the gulag or like bumped off, whatever. Arnold Deutsch was quite lucky. All he got was sort of shuffled aside, but
yeah,
he,
right.
he was treated very badly given that how brilliant he was. So there's this moment, there's the terror, and then there's the signing of the Nazi-Soviet pact. Soviet intelligence is in disarray, right? And the Soviets' position as the kind of spearhead of revolution is in moral
Yeah,
jeopardy, right? It doesn't make any sense anymore because they've become allies with, and lots of communists all across Europe tear up their Communist Party cards. And at least two of the men recruited by Anthony Blunt do seem to have, you know, stopped spying for the Soviets as a
right.
direct right result of the Nazi-Soviet pact. It was possible to disappear. It was possible to stop spying. It was possible to walk away at that point. All of these guys double down. They double down. They have to work so hard to get their information to Russia.
Mm,
They don't have their own handlers, So Philby's getting Philby at this point. He's going along with the British Expeditionary Force in France. Anything he can find out, like about the British, about that, which is at that point at war with like Stalin's ally, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Anything he can find out, he's trying to get it. He manages to get it through the embassy to the Soviet embassy through his ex-wife, and so they work hard to stay in contact in this point, and they succeed. And I just don't think we should forget that, because this is another one of these sort of slight myths that once you've signed up for the Soviet intelligence, you couldn't back down, and they could make you whatever, and they could keep you because they've got this, that, and the other. I mean, at this point, that's just not true. And
Yeah.
there's, in fact, so Gawani Rees, who we've mentioned a couple of times, was recruited by Anthony Blunt. When the Nazi-Soviet pact is signed, Blunt and Burgess come racing back to London. They've been in France, and they're kind of a bit in disarray. But by the time they get back, they convince themselves it's all just a cunning plan by Stalin. And Burgess goes to see Rees, and Reese is so devastated by the Nazi-Soviet pact, and he basically says, let's, obviously we're not going to do any more spying for these guys. So, like, we need to come out. And he thought that they'd sort of agreed on that. Burgess, meanwhile, comes out of that meeting with Reese, and he goes straight to his contact in the Soviet
Yeah.
intelligence. He does have one at this stage, and demands that Reese be murdered. Reese is one of his closest friends, but he wants him bumped off because he knows too much. And the Soviets say no, right? So, I feel like their behaviour in that period after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and before Operation Barbarossa exposes the lie that these guys were anti-fascists who were trying to
Mm.
do the right thing.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Were they perhaps even more important, or that they became a focus of the way Stalin used as policy, in the
Mm,
sense that we'd had the Stalinist purge. He'd got rid of his best generals. He'd got rid of his best people. He was struggling domestically because
mm.
of what he'd done. And this was a new route to have a source of information and power from outside that actually could cover some of that. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I mean, I think the outcome of the terror, though, was it was both destabilizing from the way that you say, because
Mm,
he got rid of a lot of his best people, and like Soviet intelligence, just for a start, was
mm,
completely decimated by this, and it took a while to recover. But on the other hand, when the dust had settled and everything got a bit more business as usual, what he had done is got rid of an entire generation of people, and the ones who were brought in were his own children, right? They were
right.
young men and women um, who had only ever known communism, who accepted that Stalin was it, who were brutalized by the terror and owed their position to the terror, and weren't going to rock the boat. So it both destabilized and then consolidated, I think, his power internally. But yes, so he the intelligence networks were really, really helpful. And it wasn't just in Britain, of course. It was the Soviets were doing amazing things, penetrating American, Canadian, Australian. Like they were
Yeah,
everywhere. Japan, of course. Richard Sorge, the very famous illegal who
right.
was operating in Japan. So he had networks, and one of the, I suppose, interesting things is because he had this sort of had created a shadow world in his enemies and allies kingdoms, it fed his paranoia that there were spies within his own. So again, like the terror was a kind of, Stalin was kind of brilliant and paranoid and
Yeah. There's a
ideologically
brilliant
committed.
sign of that in his reaction to some information that comes from Richard Sorg from Japan, who's one of his
Mm.
great spies. But he calls him a disinformer rather than an actual spy because he just doesn't want to believe what he's getting. And he was terribly paranoid about information if he couldn't be
Yeah, he
verified from
was.
several sources.
He was. So obviously one of the difficulties in the book is you can see we have lots of information about what the five were giving to the Soviets. The How much space that information took in Stalin's mind when he was making the decisions is less clear.
Mm.
So, I don't, it constantly, I don't want to sort of overclaim for
Yeah,
their
right.
influence,
No,
but
but what does
equally,
become very clear, though, when we look at the Second World War, and you
mm,
mentioned the Americans, I think it's important to say about Harry Hopkins, and Alger
mm,
Hiss and that, so American spies as well.
yeah,
But he basically there's two things going on. One is that these guys seem to be able to just walk out of documents in their trousers or in their briefcases, anything they
yeah,
fancy taking. They have
yeah,
access to phenomenal secrets because they're all now in really important positions during the war, and they
yeah.
just walk out with this stuff. That just happens. But it's that what it does for Stalin is that he now has the inside track on the thinking from the Allied perspective. So when it comes to issues, because obviously that during the war they're discussing things like what's the post-war world going to look like, and perhaps we can talk specifically about the Baltics and so on. But essentially, Stalin knows both sides of the debate or the argument before he gets going.
This is it. This is it, right? So this is so important. So he's getting at various stages, like, so it's really complicated. Like, they move in and out of jobs, and you know, I'm not going to bore everybody with it now, but like at various stages, he has access to the full cabinet minutes
Mm.
of the British. He has, you know, access. He knows everything about the two intelligence services through Donald Maclean. He knows everything that's going on at the Foreign Office. Parts because of Burgess, he has access to all the telegrams coming in and out of the Foreign Office. Crucially, towards the end of the war, he has access through Donald Maclean to the personal correspondence between Franklin Roosevelt and
Yeah,
Winston
right.
Churchill at the end of the war. I mean, it's mind blowing. Now, the reason all of this matters is because Stalin's grand strategic plan, which he reveals by the secret protocol in the not in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, is
Hmm.
that he wants to push the um, ideological vision of communism out and beyond Russian borders into Poland, across the Baltics. He wants to recover the lost lands that had once been part of Tsarist Russia and had been given independence in the Treaty of Versailles. He wants to expand, right? And you can see that's in his policy before the war. It's what he's driving towards during the war. And actually, there's one moment where some British, you know, even when Hitler's knocking at the gates, the British are often astonished by how focused Stalin is on what the post-war world might look like. You know, he this is a preoccupation all the way through the war, and it's obviously at the end of the war, it's absolutely central. What do the Soviet borders look like? What does the sphere of influence around its borders look like? So it is absolutely crucial to him that he can see behind the scenes and eavesdrop behind the scenes on the British and the Americans, who are the only people who really matter in, you know, how he's going to fulfill that grand strategic vision. And yeah, it starts off obviously with the British feeling like they are more the dictator of these
Hmm.
things, and then it slowly becomes obvious that it's the Americans who hold all the cards. But so yeah, to be able to sort of eavesdrop on the decision making, on the you know, on the money, like quite often there's people in the, you know, he's got John Cairncross in and out of the Treasury, giving him
Yes,
like
right.
unbelievable access to what the British are spending on things. You know, the early John Cairncross is the first atomic spy, right? The Soviets know that they're working on the atomic project
Mm.
earlier, you know, because of John Cairncross. So he has access to the most unbelievable treasury of information to allow him to plan and you know, for the future, outmaneuver his allies, consolidate his power, and it's extraordinary. And one of the kind of ways I think about it is, you know, if you think about the current news, we got
Hmm.
quite excited because the Chinese seem to have a spy who was married to a very low level MP,
Yeah,
right?
right.
What we're talking about with the Cambridge Five, especially when Donald Maclean gets posted to Washington in 1944, is is Stalin, who was, you know, an uneasy ally by that stage, having the ability to eavesdrop on the difference between the diplomatic bluster of his allies and their behind the
Yeah,
scenes
yeah,
positioning. And he is an astute enough and brilliant enough politician to see that gap
yeah.
and lever his way through it.
Yeah, I mean, it's playing a
Um,
game of poker when you've seen your opponent's cards, isn't it?
exactly, Paul. Exactly.
So this goes to what you were saying earlier about, and we've talked about Philby and this man who couldn't lie. But actually, this is an incredibly manipulative character. First of all, he's lying to everybody, but
Yeah.
it's one side of it is the stuff that he's stealing and sending to Russia. The other
Mm,
side of it is the stuff he's sending, and this shows up a lot after the war about Russia, because when the war ends, of course, we wind up in this situation where Britain has to take a different stance to Russia. It's been
mm.
developing slightly, but now it becomes a full blown thing. And he's in a position to block what we understand about Russia. And when Churchill talks about the Iron Curtain coming down, it's because we can't see behind it. We have no idea what the hell is going on. And that's partly down to Philby, too.
It is. So towards the end of the war, the British and the Americans begin to realize that, okay, we might have a problem after the war with our gallant allies, the Soviets, and we have no eyes on them. So it's actually quite early. It's 1943 that the British decide actually we might need a bit of a beefed up Soviet
Mm.
section. So they get a guy in who isn't Philby to kind of look, to kind of review what the situation is in terms of eyes on the Soviets. And then in 1944, they basically have set up this thing called Section 9, which is supposed to be Soviet counterintelligence, SIS, Soviet counterintelligence, which is supposed to be, eyes on. And the man they put in charge of that is Kim Philby. It's unbelievable. So the man in charge of
It is.
spying on the Soviets is a Soviet spy. So yeah, and then so there's this period basically towards the end of the war where the Soviets are trying to consolidate the position they found themselves in by having their boots on the ground. And there are two ways that they're doing this. And in both, the Cambridge Five are really helpful. So one is both Anthony Blunt and Kim Philby and John Cairncross actually are giving them loads and loads of information about anti-Soviet resistance, which is also, some of which had been allied to the Germans, so it's all quite morally murky, but a lot of which is just, people in the Baltics and in Poland and elsewhere trying to wrestle some measure of independence and agency from the kind of chaos that is the end of the war. But Philby, Burgess and Cairncross are very helpfully supplying the Russians with loads of information that really, really helps them in their project to mop up brutally that potential resistance, particularly in Poland. It's brutal. And the other half of that is that Stalin needs to consolidate his position diplomatically. And as I said, they've got Donald Maclean in the Foreign Office giving them eyes on. They've got, the spies are very helpful at Yalta, in the run up to that, at Tehran, the big conference where effectively Churchill gives Poland to the Soviets. So in both the diplomatic arena and in boots on the ground arena, while the Soviets are kind of embarking on this mission to kind of consolidate the control that the advances of the Red Army have given them, they have this incredibly helpful double layer of intelligence coming straight from the Cambridge Five.
Yeah, and what's going on in the background as well, of course, is the bomb, and that
Yeah,
develops as we go through the war. Yeah,
yeah, absolutely. So they got first sight on the bomb through Cairncross, then later on, Philby helps scupper. Like there's two atomic spies unmasked, Fuchs and Nunn May, and Philby is instrumental in sort of scuppering the investigations into those. And then Donald Maclean becomes kind of liaison with the
yeah,
American nuclear weapons program, and he has like unfettered access to the building where all of that's happening, so he's helping out too. So yeah, they definitely, so the Soviets get the bomb earlier than they would have done, not just obviously just Cambridge Five, but yeah, they were certainly helpful.
yeah. And the other thing is, so then when the war's ended, we've talked about Poland a little bit there. Um, the resistance in all of the Baltic states and in
Mm.
Albania. I knew a little bit about Albania in the sense that after the Second World War, Truman got rid of the OSS, and it's a couple of years before the CIA is established in 47. When the CIA is established, one of their earliest operations is this operation in Albania. You managed to get a lot of information on this situation in Albania. And so tell us a little, because this basically is a situation that could be replicated across the Ukraine and across the Baltic states in terms of what happened to the people who were sent. And that's because of these spies. So tell us a little bit about Albania.
Yeah, it's completely fascinating. So Albania was one of a number of projects. The British and the Americans had sort of parallel missions across the Soviet Union to try and get eyes on, and I kind of modelled a little bit on what was happening with SOE.
Right.
So the intention of these was not necessarily regime change. I mean, the Albania mission was briefly considered to be a potential
Mm-hmm.
regime change mission, but actually that rode back quite quickly. Um, the idea was to get eyes behind the Iron Curtain because they didn't have any. The idea was to use sort of expat, sort of, displaced people, send them back home, get them making mischief, getting eyes on the Soviet Union, making contacts with the existing partisans, because all these places had partisan movements who were valiantly and hopelessly fighting against the Soviet aggression, and sort of, yeah, a bit SOE-ish. So the Americans and the British had developed separate ideas about doing Albanian missions, and it's always considered probable that it wasn't Philby who leaked the Albanian mission to the
Yeah, right.
Soviets, because he wasn't in Britain at the time. Perfectly possible. I did find, however, evidence that the person who probably leaked it all to the Soviets was Guy Burgess, because
Right.
Guy Burgess's best friend in the Foreign Office was a guy called Fred Warner. And in the files about Albania, I found what looks like a handwritten note from Guy to Fred saying what's going on with the Albania stuff we've talked about. The next day, Fred is the private secretary to Hector McNeill, who's one of the involved in all of this, and Fred says, my cabinet secretary, my minister, sorry, my minister wants to know what's going on with the Albanian stuff. The people running the Albanian mission send Fred chapter and verse, and it's all prompted by Guy Burgess. And like a week later, before Philby gets back from his overseas posting and takes over, the Soviets have had chapter and verse on the British Albanian
Yeah,
mission. So
that's
it
really
looked to me,
interesting because my assumption was always along the lines of because he was a friend of Angleton, that, Angleton had told Philby and Philby had spilled the beans off the back of that.
no, because the timing of it, the Soviets basically are
Mm,
sending information about Albania back to Moscow from London when it couldn't have been Philby. So,
right.
but Philby comes back. He'd been posted abroad. He comes back and he's given the job of um, taking over as the liaison man in Washington between SIS and the CIA, with a particular responsibility for Albania. So at that point, then it seems like he leaked even more to the Soviets, right? So they were fully briefed before the Albanian plan even took off. So then the British and the Americans, they basically round up these poor Albanian displaced people. Philby and his CIA friends make fun of them, these agents that they're corralling into camps, and the camps are actually quite brutal places. Like
Mm,
they're kind of being trained, but they're not really allowed to communicate with the outside world. It's all actually a little nasty, but they train these guys and they send them into missions in Albania. And I was very lucky. I got so the Albanian Sigurimi archives, the secret police archives, only opened a few years ago,
right.
and I managed to find a brilliant Albanian researcher called Enksi Beksa, who Enksi Becker, I think. So big shout out, she's listening. She's amazing. So we between us got access to the Sigurimi archives, and we were trying to look at what was going on from the other side of the perspective, like
Right.
what did it look like, and we found some amazing stuff in there. It was like incredible. So one thing that we found is a direct line between what so Albania is theoretically not Soviet, right? It's
Yeah,
being run
yeah,
by
right.
Hoxha. But we found in the Sigurimi archives the fact that the Soviet embassy was telling the Sigurimi when missions were coming and where they were coming from and who was training them, right? So that
Yeah.
that
See, that's
was
something that I
explicitly
don't think
there.
you would have imagined if you hadn't got access to the archives.
No. And then I found some amazing stuff about the kind of the counterintelligence measures that the Albanians were taking against these guys. And they knew. So one of the really heartbreaking things is that so we know from Kim Philby's handler at that time, Yuri Modin. Yuri Modin says that Philby was sending all the details, everything he could about all these missions.
Mm,
Sometimes he only had names. Sometimes he had he wasn't one of the reasons why Kim Philby's contribution to this to these all these missions being completely useless is that he didn't have always access to operational details, right?
mm,
So therefore, we're like, well, maybe his case has been overstated. But here's an example. In the Albanian missions, they deliberately sent these Albanians back to the areas of Albania that they had come from, right?
Right.
So all Philby needs to do is give a list of names
Yeah.
to the Soviets, right? And they can find, which they did, because I've seen it in the Segurami files, they can find their friends, they can find their families, they can say when they can set up, ambushes for when these guys arrive, like, and they can, torture and strong arm and humiliate to their heart's content. The other thing they did, and I did lots of work on this in the Lithuanian archives as well, and some in the Polish. And this again happened across all the operations across the Soviet world. They played what's called radio games. So when Kim Philby betrays a mission, the Soviets don't just collect these guys and shoot them in the head. What they
Mm,
do is they collect them, they brutalize them, they turn them,
mm,
then they get them to send radio messages back to the Western intelligence saying, "We're doing brilliantly, send more men, send more money,
yeah.
send more arms." And this is what happens. And so by the time, another reason why Kim Philby's contribution has often been downplayed, I think, is because these missions carried on after he'd gone
Mm,
and
right.
continued to be absolutely devastatingly hopeless for the men involved, right? So everybody's like, oh, well, it's not. But by the time Kim Philby had gone, everything that he'd supplied and the brilliance of Soviet counterintelligence on the ground meant that these whole
Yeah.
operations were so riddled with leaks
They
and
knew
so
exactly what they were
transparent
doing.
that, and
Mm,
right, that they were, it was hopeless.
yeah.
So he was, instrumental, I think, in meaning that these things were stillborn. And even worse, Paul,
Mm,
is when he was captured or when he was unmasked, right? They knew, the Americans and the British knew that these missions were failing, right? And I found an amazing CIA document where basically it's an internal document. It says, look, these missions are just a complete failure. But if we admit to the State Department that we can't even get a small operation
yeah.
off
Right.
Albania off the ground, then, they're going to cut our money and they're not going to
Mm.
let us mount anything bigger, right? So they know that it's a failure. But they tell themselves that Kim Philby probably betrayed it all. So now we can just carry on and it'll be
So essentially,
fine.
you've got two sides colluding in the lie.
Right. So
Yeah.
then these missions carry on after he's gone and they carry on sending these men to their deaths. I mean,
That's
like just countless. And then I found this heartbreaking lesson that I put in the book from one of the Albanians in one of these camps going, they sent my brother that, like, he never came back. They want to send me. I don't want to go. They won't let
yeah,
me leave
yeah.
the camp. Like, it's just like awful what they did.
And I think
Um,
this really illustrates the human cost of this, because this again is something that we've kind of let them off with spying, giving away secrets. No, what they're actually doing is they're causing the deaths of these people. This particular statistics you give for Albania, of 1,650 men sent in a period of 3 years, 253 were killed instantly, 417 captured straight away, 390 forced to surrender, and about 570 who managed to escape.
yeah.
Now, that's the real statistics. That's real dead bodies, real families, real harm that these people caused. The worst kind
Yeah.
of harm you can cause.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and not just Albania, all across this world,
Yeah,
there were
right.
men being parachuted in, they were going on boats. They were brave men who were flying straight into a trap. And then, some of it is a bit morally murky. Okay, so I did some work on Ukrainian operations, and the British recruited from the Galicia division, which was a division of the SS, and
Yeah.
those men were resettled in Britain, and it was those men who were recruited by the British to be parachuted into Ukraine. So obviously, some of these guys are Nazis, right? Or they're certainly complicit in Nazi crimes. I I tracked down the last mission that Philby betrayed, and, like, you can't get to any of this stuff through the SIS files because they're not public. But I found all the SIS briefings of this mission that had gone to the CIA. So I found all this in the CIA files, which is marvelously exciting.
Mm.
But anyway, um, you know, some of the some of the boys being parachuted into Ukraine on a mission that Philby explicitly admits to betraying were like 20 years old, 22 years old, which means that when the Galicia division was formed, they were 14 12.
Right, yeah.
Right? So, you know, how can we pass moral judgment on these boys for who were almost certainly
The
orphans?
sins that were committed
Because,
when they couldn't possibly impart it.
yeah, in a country that have been declassified, suffered from famine, invaded by Nazis, invaded by Soviets. I mean, so the point is, we don't know much about what these boys did and how they got there, but neither did Kim Philby, and he didn't care, because anybody who was fighting against the Soviet Union is a fascist. Blanket, right? Doesn't matter, and they deserve whatever hideous death awaits them when he sets the trap as they parachute into
No,
Ukraine.
and you're right. It's illustrative of a wider story, which is that we don't want to talk about anything that complicates the story of Nazis bad, us good.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
it's
100%.
one of those things. Okay, so now we get to the stage, to the back end of the 40s, very start of the 50s, where the CIA and the FBI are pissed off. You know, MI5 are starting to ask questions. It is starting to unravel. Too much is going wrong. What actually happened at that point?
So, the big news at the end of the 40s and early 50 is that the American signals intelligence have managed to get into Soviet telegrams. So
Right.
they've managed to decrypt telegrams going from New York to Moscow, intelligence intercepts. And they've managed to decrypt some of these. And they are, the ones that matter for our purposes are all from around March 1945. And they're all originating from a Soviet agent with the code name Homer, possibly Goma in some places. Now, when Kim Philby is posted to Washington to take over the Albanian stuff and other things, he is told about the Venona files and the Venona operation and what they found. And Philby very, very quickly realizes that this is Donald Maclean, that Homer is Donald Maclean. And so quite early, sort of 1950, they begin to understand that it might only be a matter of time before Donald Maclean is unmasked. So Kim Philby does two things. The first is he lays a paper trail at MI5, basically, which could later look like he was alerting them.
Right.
It would exculpate him in the case of Donald Maclean. So Kim Philby threw Donald Maclean under a bus very early, right? The second thing that happens is that there is a kind of British team at the Washington Embassy that's trying to unmask Homer, and it's all obviously top secret. Paul, guess who's on that team?
I wouldn't get any prizes for that, would I?
Yeah, no. Bloody Kim Philby. So Kim Philby, top Soviet spy, is investigating Donald Maclean, top Soviet spy, from sort of end 1950 into 1951. So it's all very exciting because very shortly, Paul, it is going to become obvious that Donald Maclean can no longer escape detection. And then what is that going to mean for Kim Philby? What is that going to mean for Guy Burgess, Blunt and Cairncross?
And I think that's a good point to call it a halt, I think, for the moment. That's part one. And so we pause there for the next episode. And don't forget that the book is out today, so if you do want to get Stalin's Apostles by Antonia Senior, you can get it from all good book outlets, or you can get it from us by clicking the link on the program notes. And you can get it there. So as you already know, I'll be back with another interview, the second part of my chat with Antonia Senior. I hope you've enjoyed our chat, and bye for now.